Assalamu alaikum. How's everybody doing? Thank you for joining us for our 18th educational webinar. And this will be regarding Biden's Middle East trip. The title is Who Benefits? And we're so honored to have at our to represent the panel two phenomenal speakers, writers, and authors that will give us some insight into this Middle East trip by President Joe Biden and how this impacts Palestinian people, Palestinian rights, and the broader Middle East. It's an honor for me to welcome you all here again. My name is Tariq Khalil. I'm the Education Coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine. I want to first introduce our two speakers, and then we will go ahead and dive right into this very important topic. We have with us Mitchell Plitnick, who is a political analyst and writer and the president of ReThinking Foreign Policy. He's the author with Mark Lamont Hill of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. His previous positions include vice president at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. His writings has appeared in Haaretz, The New Republic, Responsible Statecraft, Mondoweiss, and many, many other outlets. We also have with us Phyllis Bennis, who directs the new international project at the Institute of Palestine Studies and is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She also served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and has been invited to deliver political commentary on various outlets such as Democracy Now!, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, just to name a few. She's written and edited many books. One of them is an excellent primer titled Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. I think I have one of the older editions, so mine is outdated. I would definitely have to get a new one. And with that, please welcome our two phenomenal speakers. Really, I just want to jump right into it, and just give me your overall take of this Middle East trip, if you want to call it that, to the Middle East. Who are the real beneficiaries of it? What kind of impact do you think this will have, or if it had any impact already? We can start with Mitchell, and then we'll go to Phyllis right after.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think what stood out on this trip in terms of Palestine was nothing, and a lot of it. The trip to the West Bank felt like essentially Biden was going there because if he didn't, it would be a story, and he wanted to make it less of one. So he announced a little bit more aid, but I think what was important, what was notable in the trip was what wasn't there. I mean, his decision to say, "Look, I support the two-state solution, but I'm not going to do anything about it," which he was pretty explicit in. The complete absence of the idea of accountability in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh was I think really notable. He did mention her, but it was as if her death had occurred out of nowhere, reinforcing, I think, what's been the State Department line, which is that all of these investigations that have demonstrated that it was an Israeli shot were not had not produced enough. And when the U.S. finally did admit that, yeah, it probably was the Israelis, somehow it was also an accident, although they provided no basis for that whatsoever. The whitewash, I think, was very clear. So that was disappointing. I think partially also in terms of Palestine, it was telling what happened once Biden left, because there was almost immediately destruction of homes in Masafa Yatta. There was almost immediately communications sent to the Israeli lawyers for the 6 Palestinian NGOs that had been accused of terrorism. So I think there was a sense in the Israeli government from Biden that, Palestine, do what you want. We don't really care. I think that was the message that was conveyed. As to who profits, I think the big winners were Saudi Arabia. The ambition to bring Saudi Arabia into this regional alliance is something that's that the United States and Israel are both more eager for than the Saudis are. The Saudis are more or less getting what they want out of it already, which is the sense that the sense that there's a defense that they can be involved with that is multilateral, that includes Israel, even though they're not directly talking formally to Israel. They're getting out of it what I think is most important is the United States coming back to them basically on their hands and knees. And that is a big, big plus for Mohammed bin Salman. The United Arab Emirates also comes out ahead in this new alignment that's called the I2U2 that involves the UAE, United States. Those are the two U's, and the two I's are Israel and India, which I think is sort of interesting from the point of view of some work I'm doing right now on Islamophobia in U.S. policy. Considering Israel and what's happening in India to Muslims right now, that's the alignment that the UAE is so interested in. That's though mostly an economic agreement. I think it's an important one, but so they come out ahead in that as well. Israel gets something. They got once again the absolute devotion of Joe Biden, who is very strongly pro-Israel and is essentially continuing the policies of Donald Trump, both towards Israel and towards Iran, that supposedly he was supposed to come in and reverse. So on the whole, this was just entirely bad news. I think the one thing that occurred around this, where there's the slightest glimmer of hope, which has nothing really to do with Biden's trip per se, but happened around the same time, is the continuation of talks that are being brokered by Baghdad between Iran and Saudi Arabia that could they've been moving slowly, but they have been moving forward and could conceivably lead to a rapprochement between the two countries. This could be important especially if it happens. When I say important for Palestine, it could have positive implications if it happens before King Salman dies. Because he's still, unlike his son, is still adhering to the idea that normalization with Israel depends on the Arab Peace Initiative. And that is something that if they were actually, easing tensions with Iran, could be pushed forward conceivably if those two countries and the rest of the Arab League wanted, had the political will to do so. So, there's a there are a few other things that came out of this. I think one of the overriding thing from the American point of view is nothing that happened here necessitated a presidential visit. There was nothing happened here that could not have been done by video, by phone calls. There really was no reason for it. There was no reason for Biden to stir up the controversy with his stupid fist bump. So it was, I think, another sign of this administration's real sort of shocking ineptitude when it comes to foreign policy. And I'll leave the rest for Phyllis.
Oh, you left that fist bump. I was leaving that for a question. You threw it. You definitely threw it in there. Before I turn it over to Phyllis, one statement that caught a lot of media attention that he said was, and he said it like 30 years prior, you need not be a Jew to be a Zionist. He loves to put that in his speeches. I don't know why, but anyway, Phyllis, please tackle that same question.
Yeah.
Right ahead.
Thanks, Tarek. I think that one of the things that we're seeing on this trip, I disagree with Mitchell about one thing. I think there was a reason for this trip. It had nothing to do with Palestine. It actually had nothing to do with Israel either, in terms of the timing. The timing had a lot to do with the war in Ukraine and the rising price of gasoline in the US and the elections that are coming up, the midterms in November. So this was a lot about Biden needing to show US voters that he's doing everything possible to bring down the price of gas at the pump. Now, nothing that he was going to get from the Saudis is going to bring down the price of gas at the pump anytime soon. But this gave him the photo op. I think he was hoping that not enough people would really care about the fist bump enough to make that a problem, that showing him going off to Saudi Arabia to urge the Saudis to produce more oil to bring down the price of gasoline, that somehow that's going to help in the midterms. I don't think it's going to, because I don't think it's going to bring down the price of gasoline in the midterms, even if there is some small increase at some point after the August meeting of OPEC plus organizations. But I think that what we are looking at here was, on the question of Palestine, we did see a couple of significant losses. This was not just nothing. And that was that it has now been 18 months since Biden took office. In that 18 months, he has not done a number of things that could have begun the process of reversing the really extremist policies that his predecessor had put in motion. So in 2018, Trump not only walked away from the Iran nuclear accord, the JCPOA, he also went to Israel, he went to Jerusalem, and he announced a set of really extremist policies that were different than his predecessors. The key things, $3.8 billion a year as a starting amount of US military aid, absolute protection of Israel at the United Nations and keeping them out of the International Criminal Court, all those things remained. But what changed were the extremist policies that Trump put in motion. So number one, moving the US embassy out of Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in complete violation of international law. Number two, recognizing the Israeli annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights as somehow acceptable and legal, and now this is diplomatic recognition, saying that the illegal Israeli settlements are somehow legal now. All of these things, there were more, but those were some of the most important, that there will be no consulate in East Jerusalem. All of these things were announced by Trump and have been ignored by Biden, not requiring congressional approval, but he has not made any motion to change them. So these are now Biden's policies. These are no longer Trump's policies. This is now US policy. Is the US embassy belongs in Jerusalem. The Syrian Golan Heights belongs to Israel. The potential future annexation of much of the West Bank would be completely acceptable. Sorry. The settlements are legal. All of these things are now official US Biden policies. They are no longer leftovers. You can't really make that claim after a year and a half in office. If we look at who else gained from this, along with the Israelis, we know who lost. It certainly included Saudi Arabia, and specifically MBS, the Crown Prince, who got the fist bump, got the legitimacy that he has been wanting, and he got the potential to move forward as the leader of a regional anti-Iran coalition with Israel. The Abraham Accords, which so far does not include Saudi Arabia for the reasons that Mitchell referenced, because the king, unlike the Crown Prince, still is holding to the notion of the Arab peace deal of 2002, or also known as the Saudi peace arrangement, none of which has ever been put into action, and none of the other Arab states seem particularly concerned about violating it at this point. So I don't really think that that's going to be the basis for a new potential rapprochement. I think the Abraham Accords are going to be expanded to include Saudi Arabia. I'm not quite as optimistic as Mitchell about the possibility of a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think that antagonism is going to continue even with a ceasefire holding, if it does. Hopefully it will in Yemen. So we have a very messy set of realities right now. In the visit to Bethlehem, in the visit to the West Bank, clearly there was nothing there. There was no reason for that to even happen, except, as Mitchell said, that to not do it would have been greater. But what was extraordinary was they made a decision to stay in the motorcade, not to go in a helicopter, which means there is no way that he didn't see the apartheid wall, the checkpoint between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which for people who have been there know is the equivalent to a giant military airport to get through that. And none of it was mentioned. Settlements were not mentioned. Home demolitions were not mentioned. The killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, of course, was not mentioned. Even the small mention of possibly reopening the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which was mentioned not by Biden, but by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who said, we would like to see a consulate in East Jerusalem, pause. But that requires, he said, that requires engagement with the Israeli government, requires engagement with the Israeli leadership. And left unsaid was the follow-up, and therefore we're not going to do it. But even that was then challenged when a spokesman from the NSC had to walk it back about 2 hours later, came out and told the press corps that what Jake Sullivan meant to say was we would like to see a consulate in Jerusalem because, you know, they don't talk about East Jerusalem. Occupied East Jerusalem is not on the US agenda. They would not acknowledge that the whole point of having a separate consulate was always because it could serve as Palestinians who were living under occupation. So all of this is an indication that things have gone backwards, not forward. And I think that we're looking at a very serious challenge here. One of the ironies here, and this isn't exactly part of your question, Tarek, but I think it's important for us to be considering it. One of the ironies of this whole visit from the Palestinian, the question of Palestinian rights, is that we see these long-standing terrible policies being strengthened, being left in place, just at the time when all major international human rights organizations are now making clear that Israel's policies are the policies of apartheid, when we see massive shifts in the public and media discourse in the United States. We now have 25% of Jews saying that Israel is an apartheid state. We're even seeing the beginnings, just the beginnings, of some shifts in the policy discourse. You know, the fact that last year when Israel was attacking Gaza, there were the 12 Jewish members of the House of Representatives who signed a letter to their own president, to their own party, urging a ceasefire when Biden was still opposing a ceasefire. 25 members of the Senate did the same thing. And crucially, 500 former staffers of the Biden campaign team, 500 of them, signed off on a really strong letter that talked about the 73 years of ethnic cleansing and how this is only an escalation of that. It was an incredibly powerful letter, also demanding an immediate ceasefire. All of these are interesting potential shifts in the policy discourse, and yet it's right at this moment that we see an absolute refusal to see any motion in the administration on these questions, and now, in fact, adopting the once opposed, really extremist Trump positions as Biden's own.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Phyllis. There was a lot there, and I know that some of that was in response to things that Mitchell said. And Mitchell, I want to give you the chance to respond to that, but I did want to add one layer that I wanted you both to tackle. Biden did say the words, "I reversed the policies of my predecessor," but then went on to explain what that was, and that was regarding aid to the Palestinians. So we're gonna just funnel more money to the poor refugees, and that is the reversal that I made. Essentially conceding that that's all you're gonna get in terms of any kind of reversal of policies. So Mitchell, if you can please respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I largely agree with what Phyllis said. So, you know, I don't. We disagree on some relatively minor issues. I would say one thing that I want to pick up on is this question of the policy discourse, because it is a really important one. You know, this is all happening, as Phyllis said, just at a time when human rights organizations are uniting around the idea that this is apartheid. These and even the ones that are not actually using the word are being very clear about war crimes that are going on in the West Bank and Gaza, and discrimination also within Israel itself against Palestinian citizens. So that is a big problem, obviously. It is being responded to by the government with this sort of stonewalling, but it's generating, I think, a much stronger response in in domestic politics in the United States. As we know, AIPAC has created two political action committees, and they are pumping tons of money into select races to unseat or defeat progressives. And I think this is one of the things about the question of Palestine has always been, I think, that it's so it has always been, I think, at least I've always thought of it as symbolically central to a lot of progressive causes around the world. Now it's being expanded. The fight against Palestinian rights by these pro-apartheid groups like AIPAC is being expanded to attack all progressives. So you have right now in the race in Michigan, a Jewish, by his own self-description, very Jewish member of Congress, Andy Levin, who's part of essentially a Democratic political dynasty, and AIPAC is going with everything they can to defeat him, and likely he is going to lose because he had the audacity to support a two-state solution that, and support steps to actually get there. Support some policy steps that would actually get to that solution. So whether you support a two-state solution or not, the idea that is now going to get him bounced out of Congress when that's not even an issue in his district. Nobody is making that an issue. The race between him and Haley Stevens, his opponent, because of redistricting, they're both incumbents. But nobody's actually talking about Israel. Nobody's saying, the campaign against Levin is not, he is anti-Israel, therefore don't vote for him. The campaign against Andy Levin is, about a whole bunch of other things and why, he would be so terrible without ever mentioning Israel. A similar thing just happened in Maryland, where Donna Edwards, who formerly was a member of Congress from Maryland, was trying to get reelected, and AIPAC went all in against her, spent $4 million to make sure that she lost that race. Again, never mentioning Israel, but that's what lost her the race. We're now seeing a place where there is tons and tons of money coming in against progressive candidates in the United States, in the same way that globally, the human rights movement, which is finally and correctly labeling Israeli practices apartheid, is being marginalized and demonized as a result. So that entire regime of human rights, the entire reputation of groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch is being besmirched, it's over Palestine, but it will apply to all the work that they're doing. So I guess, to me, this is a moment where we're seeing an all-out assault on Palestine that will affect the rest of the world. I'm sure everybody watching here, you're deeply concerned about Palestine, but you may have friends who that's not their main issue. Well, it still matters to them, and they need to know that.
I would just say one thing slightly different on the question of the way that the human rights organizations are being seen. I don't see as much of a demonization as I think AIPAC and their friends would have liked in this case. It's very hard to undo the years, even more so with Human Rights Watch. It's not to say there's not efforts going on, but I think the fact that when I spoke of the policy discourse, I was speaking a little bit differently than the political discourse that I think you're targeting, Mitchell, which I agree with, not necessarily quite so much on the human rights organizations, but in general, in the political world, it is much more central now. It's being viewed in the context of the anti-racist movement. It's being viewed as something that people have to address in ways that they didn't used to have to address. They could ignore it without much consequence. But I also think that we're seeing within Congress and in the debate and the discourse in and around Congress, partly because of the small number of new members of Congress who come in as real champions of Palestinian rights, but they are few and far between, and none of them are yet in a position where they're able to mobilize the kinds of coalitions that will be required to actually vote on new policies. We're not there yet. But where we are is not only their presence changing the discourse, but we're seeing the willingness of these others. When I mentioned, for example, the 12 members of the House and 25 in the Senate who wrote these sort of amazing letters to Biden. They weren't amazing because of what they said. They all started with recognizing Israel's right of so-called self-defense, et cetera. But their conclusion, their point was, we are challenging the president from our own party to demand of Israel something Israel doesn't want to do. That is huge. That's amazing. And then when you had 500 members of the staff of the people who got Biden elected in 2020, that's what was really extraordinary this time around, because their article, their letter, it included some language that you and I might not have included, but basically they were saying real history. They were talking about 73 years of ethnic cleansing has led to this attack. And whoa, that's intense. And when it comes from the people who elect the president, that means a lot. So I think that we are seeing a very different level of discourse on the political and congressional side, but it's a struggle that's now ahead that's, I think, going to be even harder than the hard work of changing the public discourse and the media discourse, which has taken us 20 years or more. It's going to be a long and hard struggle to turn that discourse into a real change of real policy. And that's what lies ahead.
Yeah, no, so just really quickly, I mean, I completely agree with you, Phyllis. What I'm suggesting is that what AIPAC's doing now, and the reason that AIPAC suddenly decided after 70 years, essentially, of not wanting to directly engage in political campaigning for candidates, so they suddenly changed. I'm suggesting that what you're describing is exactly why they did that, and that this is their way of stamping that out. Because I think, working in Washington, I think we all know that for years we've heard, many years, long before, back in the days of Bill Clinton and even earlier, we've heard staffers say, yeah, I know that this is the way it is, but the political realities and blah blah blah, and one way or another, we heard it. And if you were in a congressional office, you hear it from the staffers. You might even hear it from the member on occasion, but you're not going to hear it in public. And now we are hearing it in public, and that is a major shift. And you're right. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that's why AIPAC is coming in with everything it has to smack that down.
It's that, and the fact that support for Israel has become a partisan issue.
Yes.
One of AIPAC's goals all along has been to maintain support for Israel as a bipartisan point of unity. And it increasingly is not that. We can't yet say that it's completely not. But if you look at some of these recent polls and look at the parts of them that deal with the differences in the parties, it's almost a complete reversal, where the numbers are in the mid-60s. 65% of Democrats view the Palestinians more favorably than Israelis. View Palestinians more than Israel, not Israelis, Israel. And in exactly the reverse of that, something like 65% of Republicans view Israel more favorably and less, and it's in the low 30s for the Palestinians. So it's an extraordinary way that is shifting around, because what AIPAC is now concerned about, they've never had to worry about this before. They were always in the mix. They were always in there trying to make sure that it was going to be a bipartisan majority view. And they're now facing the reality that it's not, and that they're losing young people.
Right.
It's not just all Jews, it's young Jews who are turning against this absolutist kind of support for Israel. It's young Democrats that are turning away from support for Israel as a given. And that's what they're really worried about. They still clearly have the money. They raised $7 million, spent $4 million of it on Donna Edwards campaigns, but they raised $7 million, which is huge in the context of midterm congressional elections. But they no longer can deliver the votes. And eventually that's going to limit their power and influence.
No, I'm sorry. Go on, Mitchell. Please respond.
I was just going to say. I mean, I agree. I think it is a question of what I think AIPAC's tactic is right here is I think they know exactly what Phyllis just said. I think they're aware of it. I think they know they can't do this, and so and so what they're doing is they're basically subverting democracy.
Yes.
And that's a serious fight, because even though, we look at that and say, in the long run, we should win because we have the numbers, and that is true. And as long as democratic structures hold, that should mean that in the long term, this is the way it will work out. Democratic structures may not hold. I mean, and this is part of, AIPAC has essentially joined it, to the extent that they were not part of it for many years. They've joined the assault on American democracy. And that is now, I think, their tactic. And at least, the early stages right now, it's shown some signs of success. They haven't won every race. And that is promising. There are a couple of races where they backed a candidate who did not win. But, for right now, the way our politics are structured, their money can do an awful lot of damage.
Absolutely.
So it is definitely, this is their way of fighting back. I share your confidence that eventually we will win, but there's a lot of work to be done for that to happen.
Absolutely. And the price will be paid more by Palestinians than anyone else.
As usual, unfortunately.
It takes much longer. That's absolutely.
I'm really enjoying this conversation very much. I'm sure our audience is benefiting a lot from the context that you're both providing. And since Phyllis did mention the polls, we actually do have the figures here, and I just want to state it. This is the Pew Research Center, and it shows from the age group of 18 to 29, 61% expressed favorable views toward the Palestinians compared to 46% of those 50 and older. So we do see the young generation and the progressive generation not even in the majority in terms of favorability for the Palestinians. But I did want to go to one aspect here of the trip, or one statement actually that was made. Now, this is not part of the progressive discourse at all. This whole two-state discourse. I mean, now the focus is Palestinian rights, justice, liberation. That's the agenda, and that's the discourse right now, especially in progressive circles. But it is noteworthy to say that on the two-state discourse, just to illustrate how far Biden is from the genuine, so-called genuine discourse on two states. When he mentioned it during the speech next to Abbas, he said two states along the 1967 lines were mutually agreed upon swaps. And when Abbas talked about it, he talked about it on the 1967 borders without mentioning any kind of swaps. Is that relevant to the discussion, how far removed he is from even that discourse, just the two-state discourse?
It's funny. His discourse on this trip varied. I mean, on the one hand, you're right that it's limiting even his own understanding of the two-state solution. It probably, in my guess, is more a reflection of the lack, the recognition that there's just no there to this debate over the two-state solution, whether it's in the UN, whether it's in Congress. It doesn't exist. It's too late for whether or not we want to believe that it was good or bad at the beginning, whether it was just or not, whether it was even possible or not, it isn't possible any longer. There's no land left that would be enough for a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. I mean, that part is clear. But the language of Biden reflected also his own tendency towards great sympathy. He was sympathetic. He even used the word equality, which I was struck by, because that you usually don't hear from an American president when you're talking about Palestinians and Israelis. It was in the context of what Palestinians deserve. And he said they deserve, quote, equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy, Palestinians and Israelis. Now, that's rather extraordinary, because equality is one other part of what we talk about, that we want a solution that is grounded in human rights, international law, and equality for all. But we don't hear that from presidents. We did this time, and I had the sense of, what does that mean? And then I remembered, it means that he's a sympathetic guy who likes to talk about things like that. And there is nothing in this policy that will get us any closer to anything remotely looking at equality. But he did want to use the word.
Yeah, I think I have a little, I guess I have a little bit harsher view of Biden. I see him very cynically. I do not see that sympathy as sincere. And honestly, I see this through issues far beyond Palestine, domestic and foreign. I think Biden is somebody who recognizes, as does someone like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, a lot of that so-called centrist Democrat, which I would consider center right Democratic leadership, that they recognize the value of saying these words and how that affects voters and how it makes them believe that they actually care. I think Biden couldn't care less, frankly, about Palestinians. Biden, to me, is the same guy he's always been. He's the guy who dreamt up massive incarceration in a very racist way. He is the guy that savaged Anita Hill in order to get Clarence Thomas on the bench, and we're all paying the price for that. He's the guy that Obama picked specifically as his vice president in order that, racists who were disillusioned with the status quo of the Republican Party would vote for him because he's one of them. Joe Biden is not a good man, in my view. He and his entire approach to Palestine, I think, is reflective of this strategy. The equality, the idea of equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and security, that's been the Biden administration line from the beginning of the administration. Blinken, Biden has said it a couple of times before. Blinken has said it almost every time the issue has come up. It is to my mind, it's just smoke and mirrors, and it covers up but it covers up a policy that, as you pointed out, is absolutely Trumpian. And yes, I wanted to, as we mentioned earlier, that the one thing he did reverse was cutting off the funds to UNRWA, except, and that's good. UNRWA desperately needs the money, and it's a good thing that they got it back.
The $100 million to the hospitals is needed
right.
too, but
it matters.
Change. It's
Trump
change.
It's chump change, certainly next to what we give Israel, and just in general in the U.S. budget. And this is also money. Let's keep in mind that the Israeli government won't say it publicly. They want that money going there. They don't want to end up having to take care of Palestinians in hospitals in East Jerusalem. They don't want to end up, having any sense of, any of their citizens saying we have some responsibility for these people who are now starving and can't get to school. They have supported this quietly, sometimes and occasionally publicly over the years. So even this money that he restored was money Israel wants going there. He's really, I have a really low opinion of Joe Biden, if you couldn't tell.
I would say, aside from Joe Biden personally, is not the issue, but for the U.S., the military support to the Palestinians has always been the main feature of what support looks like. It's always the support that goes to the security forces, who are charged with the goal of working closely with the Israeli security forces and the Israeli military to suppress any opposition within the occupied territory. So I think that part has continued, and it remains so.
Right, and crucially, that includes opposition to the Palestinian Authority.
Exactly.
And speaking of aid, this is definitely not chump change. I believe there was a slight promise to provide more than what the Memorandum of Understanding stipulated in 2016 as well. So we're talking about 3.3 million plus the 500 million for missile defense, plus an additional few hundred million for Iron Dome and whatever other
billion each year for Iron Dome, probably.
I mean, it's laughable in comparison. So that has to be pointed out. I know 100 million sounds like it's a lot, but definitely not in comparison. Now, look, politics is always about timing. So one question that I want to put to you, Mitchell, is how about Asim Ghafour? And can you comment on the timing of his detention?
I'm not completely expert on everything that went on, so I can't speak to whether or not Asim actually committed any crime. But I do know that he would have been, if he was aware that there was any kind of case against him in the United Arab Emirates. So let me back up. So Asim Ghafour, for those who don't know, is a board member of Democracy in the Arab World Now, DAWN, which was an organization that it promotes obviously democracy in the Arab world, and a U.S. Policy that will encourage that. It was started by Jamal Khashoggi before he died, and it's been continued in his name ever since. And Asim is a board member there. He is also a lawyer for Jamal's fiance, and he is accused by the UAE of money laundering and some, I believe, fraud. And he's been sentenced to 3 years. Now, he was traveling not to the UAE, but with a stop in the UAE. And just, I believe it was like, while Biden was in the air, or was it, I forget exactly the timing, or just before he went. But the UAE arrested him, has now sentenced him to 3 years in prison. And according to their initial news release, they said that they worked with the State Department to do this. The State Department said that they did not address that. They said they're working to find out what's going on and to investigate it. They have not said that they're working to free Asim. And I think that's very crucial. It is unclear the basis of the charges. The trial obviously happened in absentia. He was quickly arrested and put in jail. So it certainly seems pretty iffy. If he thought that there could be any charges, the UAE is not exactly known for its due process in criminal cases. So if he had known there was any possibility that he could have been arrested on any charges in the UAE, he would not have gone there. He was there only as a stopover. I believe he was going to Istanbul. Yeah, that and it does not seem, Dawn has called for immediate action to get him freed, and the response from the State Department has been lukewarm. And as people probably know, it hasn't been much of a story. So, I don't have tons of detail about that, but the timing of it, I think, right around, it was either while Biden was there or just before. The timing of it is very suspect. It just seems like the UAE to arrest an American citizen, which he is, at that time, certainly seems like there had to have been some coordination with the United States to do it.
Either that, or there's also the whole question of, was this a repeat of what Netanyahu did with Obama in 2010 around the settlements? When Biden was arriving, when Biden visited on behalf of Obama, was just when the new settlement, I think it was 7,000 units, was announced right at the same time. And it's partly a slap in the face. It's partly we're going to show the world and our own population that we are not cowed by U.S. power in this situation. The UAE has a history of punching above their weight. Mm-hmm. This may have been one more example of that.
Yeah, it could be.
One of the themes that came out of this, obviously, if you just look at the statements that were made by Biden during his trips and whoever was with him, whether it's Abbas, Lapid, or during his GCC trip as well, seems to be the integration of Israel to the and you both touched on this, especially you, Phyllis, regarding the Abraham Accords, trying to bring Saudi Arabia into it, in accord with the peace initiative back in 2002. What I really wanted to get at was something that you said in your article, Phyllis, that I wanted you to touch on, is even though there's an alignment on, and this was a major theme as well, which is to kind of coalesce or retrench the coalition against Iran. And you made a distinction between the U.S. position and the Israeli position, which is the U.S. position focusing more on, we will prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, whereas the Israeli position is regarding just the program itself, which is legal under international law to have the program. So can you touch on that and why that's important?
Yeah, this is not a new thing. This is not new for Biden. This is not new for U.S. policy. This has been the U.S. position for, I guess, about 15 years now. It also has been the Israeli position. We don't have to wait, and we will not wait for Iran to have or try to get a nuclear weapon. we have the right and we will use our military. They've been very explicit about it. And in fact, what they've done so far has been, I mean, there's allegations of major Israeli involvement in a series of cyber attacks inside Iran, but even more significantly, a set of assassinations of nuclear scientists, Iranian nuclear scientists, which Israel has been accused of, has not denied, and has almost, they've come very close to acknowledging that, yes, they did it. And they are proud of it and they will do it again, has been the sort of tone. They haven't said those words, of course, but the claim has been made globally that Israel is responsible for this set of attacks. Because, you know, it's one of these situations where a nuclear program, which is legal, as you say, and is under inspection of the IAEA, and was under even greater inspection during the several years of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. It's one of the ironies, of course, that now some top Israeli generals and Mossad leaders, about 5 of them, about 3 weeks ago, I guess, came out with a public statement saying that they believe the best protection of Israel would be to go back to the Iran nuclear deal. And they were immediately slapped down, and there was a public statement saying the government makes these decisions, not any military leader. But clearly the military people are very nervous about the consequences, because once you have a program, a nuclear program, which in the Iranian case, like most, is producing enriched uranium for research, for medical purposes, it's the same method to do highly enriched uranium that you need for a nuclear bomb. You need it to be up near 90%, as opposed to between 3% and 20%, which is the low enriched uranium for research and other purposes. In that situation, it means you have scientists who know how to make a bomb possible. It doesn't mean they know how to do the rockets and the other stuff that you need to have an actual bomb. They don't have that. But they do have people who can produce nuclear fuel of a nuclear weapon. And the only way to get rid of that is to get rid of the people in whose brain that information lies. So that's what these assassinations are all about. This is Israel's version of what it means to go after the nuclear program in Iran. It may well mean, we don't know this for sure, but it may well mean that assassinating Iranian scientists is the Israeli understanding of what it will take, and that they have a right to do this to prevent Iran's nuclear program from existing. This has always been a divide between the US and Israel in terms of how to deal with Iran. And in the Jerusalem statement that was issued jointly by Israel and the US, there were a couple of lines, and that was one of them, where it was said that the United States asserts, or the United States says, or the United States will, and did not say the parties. So this was clearly one of that kind of distinctions that exist. Both, we should be clear, are very dangerous. You know, talking about militarizing the effort to prevent another nuclear war, what we should have heard from Biden on this trip was a call for a nuclear weapons free zone throughout the Middle East, something that many people around the world have called for decades now. And what has stopped it, when there are nuclear weapons free zones in so many other parts of the world, what has stopped it in the Middle East is precisely Israel's nuclear arsenal. You know, Israel has the only actual nuclear arsenal in the region. Iran doesn't. No other country does. But this kind of threat of going to war to prevent anybody else from ever having the capacity to someday, if they chose, making a decision that in the future maybe we would want to do this, going to war to stop that is a really dangerous move, not least because it means a much greater arms race in the region, and potentially a nuclear arms race. That if Iran decided that if it can't get a nuclear deal, it's going to go ahead and do that. If it did that, it would not only challenge Israel's existing nuclear monopoly, but it would mean that every other country in the region would find it necessary to start thinking about whether they also need a nuclear weapon. So it's a very, very dangerous, possibility right now.
No, absolutely. And I don't know if this will inject a little bit of humor into this, but one thing that Biden said that I just remembered, that was something that I've not heard a president say regarding the special relationship between Israel and the United States. We've heard bipartisan, we've heard sacrosanct, but bone deep. I don't understand. Is that the new terminology now to show how tight this connection really is? But I'll leave that aside.
And he said, I feel like I'm coming home. I found that.
Oh, that's right.
Also, you're the president of the United States, 6,000 miles away. You're not home when you go to Israel. You're home in Washington and in Delaware and across this country. That's your home, I thought.
Correct. And one thing that is just part of just ordinary discourse regarding Israel that I've always found problematic, but it's just part of our policy, and Biden mentioned it as well, and that is to maintain Israel's quote qualitative military edge, and that term has its own doctrinal meaning about that, and I just want to know, is this something that we here should tackle to try to reverse that policy altogether, to say, no, we should not be trying to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge? Is that something that should be part of our discourse in terms of our struggle for justice and liberation in Palestine?
I mean, I think there's merit to that. Clearly, the idea of maintaining, I mean, the qualitative military edge, for those who don't know, it basically dictates that the United States is responsible for making sure that Israel is capable of defending itself essentially against the entire Middle East region if they all come together and attack it. And not only the Middle East, but the Middle East plus Iran. It is a doctrine. I mean, if George Washington saw this, his teeth would fall back out. I mean, we can certainly attack that, and I think it would be politically wise to go after that and say, this is what kind of nonsense is this, that we are spending billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money to make sure that Israel can defend itself against a bunch of countries, half of which they now have normalization agreements with, and the other half that really don't pose any threat at all. We should really be keeping in mind, I think it's been 50 years since Israel actually fought an interstate war. It really is not that insecure a country at all. That being said, though, I think we should be looking at a broader picture. And I think if we're going to go after the qualitative military edge, that's fine, but it's important to make sure that issue doesn't get isolated, because it should be a broader question. The aid to Israel is frankly obscene. The amount of money that we're giving them is huge. We talk about the 3.8 billion. That's only the tip of the iceberg. It all comes out of taxpayer money, while we can list all these different things at home that it could be going to. More than that, I think we should be acknowledging that what it essentially is a corporate giveaway. There's all of that money, and the Obama negotiated MOU phased out the idea that Israel could keep some of that money and spend it on its own industries. Now they have to spend, I believe it's by next year or 2024, they have to spend all of it in the United States, and that will probably be the case going forward. So this is basically corporate welfare. All of that should be, I'm sorry, just really quickly, all of that should be part of our argument, and the fact that we're basically, starving our own people to fund war, much more broadly. That should, so yes, we can look at the qualitative military edge, but it's got to be part of a bigger strategy.
It's absolutely right. I would just add to that the 3.8 billion, which is the starting point for U.S. military aid, number one, it's all military. It used to be divided between military and economic aid. Israel is, of course, a very wealthy country, but it amounts to 20% of the entire military budget of Israel. We don't pay 20% of any other country's military budget, even our closest allies, Canada or the UK or anybody else. And I don't think people in this country necessarily know that our tax dollars are going to pay 1/5 of the entire military budget of this highly militarized country.
Yeah, I mean, I think this really came up pointedly last year when the debate over Iron Dome and restocking Iron Dome came up. I mean, the argument that people who were voting against that were essentially, quote unquote, leaving Israel defenseless was just the height of absurdity. Israel is more than all other issues aside, Israel is more than capable of defending itself with its own economy. It is more than capable of developing its own weaponry, and in fact, it's a major arms dealer. It is a major player in the global arms market. So Israel is quite capable of doing this stuff by itself. Now, the money goes to our own corporations, and that is a big part of the lobbying that happens in Washington. That's where companies like ReThinking and the Boeing and all of these various military tech companies come in, and that gives a lot of weight to the Israel lobby in Washington. But the idea that if you vote against $1 billion to replenish Iron Dome, which in itself a defensive weapon, but which allows Israel to attack Gaza with even greater impunity than it would already have. The absurdity of that, just my head almost exploded as I was listening to those debates in Congress last year.
Yeah, the self-defense argument has always perplexed me. That if you just talk to any average American, who do you think has a better argument for self-defense? The military occupier or the occupied subjects? It's just the basic. Forget Israel, Palestine. Just as a military occupier. Anyway, I did want to ask one question from the audience before we wrap up. How much political room do the Democrats actually have to expand toward the Palestinian causes without losing the federal election? Phyllis, you can start with that.
Yeah, and it's a really important question. Any answer has to start with, we don't know for sure. What we do know is there's been this incredible shift in the discourse in terms of voting. We do know that very, very few people in this country vote in federal elections with the question of U.S. support for Israel or the rights of Palestinians as the main basis on which they choose candidates. There are some, but they're very few. There has been an illusion that it is somehow political suicide to criticize Israel. That illusion is fading, thankfully, after a long time. We can argue about whether it was ever true, but it certainly is not true now. One of the problems we face is that members of Congress, I'm not even talking here about presidential campaigns and presidential candidates, but members of Congress, in general, I think, do not know about this shift in the discourse. I don't think they know about these polls because they live in a bubble where the news they get, they don't read 5 newspapers every day. They read their hometown paper and they read what their staff give them to read based on what they need to be able to talk about that day, or if they're doing a fundraiser when they go back to their district that night. It's a very narrowing process. And there's very few situations in which a new poll indicating that now 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state is going to be the most important point of the news that day for a member of Congress. So I think most of them don't know it. If they do, they want to know, well, what about in my district? We don't have polling by district. I wish we did. I wish there was somebody who could pay for that kind of polling to be done. That would be huge. If we could go to members of Congress and say, I know you've been interested in this issue and you've been reluctant to change it, to change your vote because you're afraid of what your constituents might think. And that's appropriate for a member of Congress. Here's some new information about what your congregants do think. So I think that we have that kind of potential right now. And it's a matter of turning this discourse shift of the public and the discourse shift of the media and the beginning discourse shift in and around Congress into a policy discourse shift and a voting shift so that members of Congress are prepared to say, you know what? Israel seems to be an apartheid state. All of our best human rights organizations say that. There must be something to it. Let's look at that. So let's examine. We don't have to start with what we are looking for to cut military aid to Israel across the board because of what it's been used for. Let's condition it according to US law, put aside international law, and say the Leahy Act requires that there be no military aid to any unit of any military in any country around the world that has carried out a gross violation of human rights. Clearly, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh was a gross violation of human rights. Clearly, that would mean that any unit of the IDF that was on duty that day outside Jenin camp should no longer get any access to any aid from the United States. That shouldn't be rocket science to figure out. So those are the kinds of things that we should be moving to enforce based on our own laws, based on what our country says is a legitimate use of military aid and what is not. So there's a lot of room there. We need to do a lot of work to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the politics, I'm really struck by what Phyllis said about we don't know. There's a lot here that we don't know, and one of the other problems with members of Congress in particular, but also presidential campaigns, that as they come around every 4 years, one of the things they do know is that a great deal of political campaign money comes from the Jewish community. At one point, I know the data that I last saw, that I've looked up about this, was about 10 years old, but it was close to half of political contributions to the Democratic Party, and about a third to the Republicans, came from the Jewish community. And that we know about major donors, Chaim Saban and Miriam Adelson and people like that. But the Jewish community is very, very organized, and they do a lot of funding drives. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out of synagogues, Jewish community centers. And the thing is that money, for the most part, and though not only the money, but the political campaigning, the votes, all of that stuff, in the minds of Congress members and people running for political office, all comes back to Israel. That's the first thing they think of when you say this person is Jewish and is giving me money. They assume that Israel is a priority, except we know from polling that it is not a priority for the overwhelming majority of Jews. In fact, numbers I've seen have indicated that there are more, just in terms of raw numbers, more Christians, evangelical Christians, who vote based on Israel, or for whom Israel is a voting priority, than there are Jews. Now, that being said, all of those people are voting Republican. So there's really nothing you're going to do about that. So who cares? So from the Democratic point of view, who cares about those people? So just wipe them out. Now, it takes political courage. It will, because this is an unknown. And the conventional wisdom has been, go along with Israel, you will be able to get support from the Jewish community. And it's a big deal. It matters in politics. Even though, again, most of that money has nothing to do with Israel. So, we need more. We're going to need to convince people. We need the kind of polling exactly that, Phyllis, you talked about. That being able to go to a district and say, look, this is what people really think about Israel and Palestine. This is how much of a priority it is. So there is that. There's also really, they're starting now to be, I believe American Muslims for Palestine is one such group that are actually putting PACs together for Palestine. Quote unquote pro-Palestinian PACs, that needs to really gear up, because, as I said before, AIPAC is really into this game, and it's going to get that between them, Democratic Majority for Israel, NORPAC, various pro-Israel PACs, that's going to get to be a nastier game, and people are going to lose races over Israel, even though Israel's never mentioned. And so there needs to be a counter for that. But there is room, and the political courage needs to be found. And part of that is going to be people finding ways to make the case to their to the person that they're supporting for Congress that, yes, you can do this, and you will not lose. It's less that, I don't think you're going to convince anyone that going against Israel is a winning political thing, because, again, it's just not that important to people. To Americans, it should be, but it's not. One way or another, it just isn't. So, but you can make the case that it's not. I think it's clear that it's not political suicide. I wrote a piece back in 2016, 2015, after Bernie Sanders made his speech in Brooklyn, talking about Palestinian rights in Brooklyn and got overwhelming cheers. And lo and behold, it did not, people said, okay, well, they cheered him there, but, let's see what the polls, he didn't suffer, not one bit in the polls over saying that. I wrote a piece saying, look, this idea that criticizing Israel's political suicide is nonsense. It's not true. We need to do a lot more of that and convince people to take that political step. I believe there's room, but we need to do more to prove it to Democrats who, frankly, just want to get reelected.
Speaking of that bipartisanism being in danger, just look at the last Democratic primary election with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. He made her look like a hawk when they talked about Palestine, and she presented the Democratic platform on that issue. But the way that he presented his point of view, she looked like a right-wing Republican. So I mean, I wish we could stay for so much longer. I really wanted to pick your brains. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights and giving the audience your wisdom and your knowledge. I greatly appreciate it. AMP appreciates it. I did want to leave off on one quick note, because we did talk about polling a lot, even among, and this is a poll from January of this year, that support even among young evangelicals is falling. Yeah. And the evangelical view is, the second, that God has an eternal covenant with the Jewish people and God gave the land to them. And, so this very extremist ideology, eschatology is rampant, and they represent the strongest supporters for Israel. So even among that group, the young people there, the support is falling. So young people, feel encouraged is what I'm saying. Just one last quick announcement. AMP is proud to announce that we will co-sponsor AJP's virtual Palestine Advocacy Days, and the event will take place between September 19th and 23rd of this year. Since 2015, AMP has organized an annual Palestine Advocacy Day and training weekend to educate students, community activists, and organizers, young and old, on civic engagement and policy work exclusively on the issue of Palestine. And as of 2021, Palestine Advocacy Days has been passed to our affiliate organization, AJP Action. And you guys, you helped us break a national record last year of the largest Palestine Advocacy Day by participating from all 50 states. Please sign up today. Be agents of change and use your right of advocating for Palestine. And inshallah, we will see a free Palestine. Thank you to our wonderful guests. Thank you for coming, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you.